Hello?
Hi, Jon Alba.
Yes, hey man, how's it going?
Yeah, this is Steve Julian from Cage Side Seats and Glove Up. How are you this morning?
I'm well, Steve. Thanks, man. How are you?
I'm great. Hey, I know a lot of people are going to be listening to the audio replay as they read this interview. So I know you said in a previous show that journalists should provide some context. So let's give it to everybody. Do you want to start with adfreeshows.com, The Extreme Life of Matt Hardy? Where do you want to start?
So I've been covering pro wrestling for about 11 or 12 years now, in addition to all the sports, traditional sports reporting that I was doing. And it was more a hobby for a period of time than anything else. Then around 2015, I was a sports director up in Bangor, Maine for an ABC Fox affiliate. And I was doing a one-man show, or I was covering a one-man show rather, that Billy Gunn was doing, and I was interviewing him afterwards, and he told me that I had a very punchable face, to which I wasn't really sure how to respond, but he said, no, that's a good thing. You'll be able to make money off of it. So here we are, 8 years later almost, and I'm trying to make some money off having a punchable face, doing podcasts and work with pro wrestlers that I grew up watching, and it's a pretty cool journey.
With a website called adfreeshows.com, how can you make money then?
So ad-free shows, there's the concept of it being that there's a main feed where all the podcasts go out to that have ads and all your traditional podcast characteristics. But ad-free shows then has the paywall platform where for different tiers per month, you get access. So ultimately, that's how it evens itself out.
So it's a little like Patreon then. When you pledge an amount each month, you get
Sure,
access to those things.
sure.
How then, from having a punchable face, did you end up working with a guy like Matt Hardy and doing a podcast with him?
Um, Once I signed on with Conrad's network full time, I wanted to try to make a splash, and I had in the back of my head for several years that I thought Matt Hardy would just be a fantastic podcast. I knew how knowledgeable he was. I knew how ahead of the curve he always was with business trends and industry trends. And he was one of my favorites growing up. So he had followed me on Twitter maybe about a year prior. And I had this pitch in my head, and I reached out to him. I said, hey, man, I've got an idea. Just give me 5 minutes of your time. That's all I need. And I'd love to pitch you on something. And about 3 weeks later, like midnight, 1 a.m., I got a call from Matt Hardy, and he was like, all right, I got 5 minutes. What you got? And the rest, as they say, is history.
Being that you mentioned being a fan of Matt Hardy, was that dynamic weird when you started doing the show with him? Was it weird to separate being a fan of his from being a co-host of his and having to know when he's in character and when he's not?
No, not at all, honestly. I think Matt and I, the true gem of our show, and I think you pick up on it, is how genuine our chemistry is. We have had chemistry since day one, and I think he and I are cut from the same cloth, which certainly helps. We have similar outlooks on pro wrestling. We share a lot of commonalities in how we view the industry and how we digest pro wrestling. And I think that lends itself to having a great show. And I firmly believe that our podcast is one of the most informative and insightful pro wrestling podcasts you're going to find out there.
Entertaining too. Let's not just say informative and insightful, entertaining as well.
Thank you. We certainly aim to be. Matt is a very entertaining guy, so it's not hard for him in that regard.
Well, speaking of entertainment, I think we got some unintentional entertainment this weekend at All Out, and in some respects, I feel like that's a shame because it wound up overshadowing a really great event with a very raucous crowd in Schaumburg, Illinois, and a lot of really good matches that people would remember fondly and want to watch again, and instead we're talking about what happened after the show.
Yeah, we certainly are. There's no doubt about that. It was one of the more surreal press conferences that I've been in my career. I've been in thousands, and that was certainly one of the more surreal ones.
If I can for a moment, I'll tell you about a surreal moment I had, and then you can compare how surreal it was for you. I was covering a UFC event in Chicago. I was there on behalf of Wrestling Observer, and I'm standing there at the post fight media scrum 2 feet away from Dana White, and he says, and I quote, Dave Meltzer is a fucking idiot, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I look down at my press credential and I look up at Dana White, and I'm thinking in my head, oh boy. That was a surreal moment for me. How surreal was it for you when CM Punk started attacking reporters before the conference even started?
I've been in so many press conferences where athletes have gone after the press. So truthfully, it really didn't faze me very much. I hadn't directly reported on any of these things, so I didn't personally feel vilified or attacked in that regard. I think he was in defense mode. And I think when you're in defense mode, that you tend to throw things out into the abyss and see what lands and what sticks. And I know it's easy to target media. I don't think well, I shouldn't say that. There were a couple times he personally came after a couple people, but I don't think he was necessarily overtly aggressive in that sense. I've certainly been in situations where people were more aggressive than he was. I think one thing that stands out to me is that pro wrestling is somewhat in a bubble, and you don't really get a whole lot of press availabilities like this in pro wrestling. So when you do have an anomaly situation like this, I think it resonates a lot more with people. As far as other pro sports go or news conferences go, I don't want to say this would be standard, because it certainly wouldn't be, but it's not the first time I've seen an athlete extremely upset with someone or with members of the press.
Or the first time any of us have seen it. Like, we've seen college football coaches and NFL coaches go off at reporters in post-game press
Right.
conferences as well. This is kind of why people tune in for press conferences. They want the drama.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily view it in that lens. I'm sure there are some fans out there that do. I certainly would prefer a press conference that doesn't have a ton of drama, because it would make my life a lot easier in terms of doing my job. But I do understand when something like this happens, everybody's talking about it, and for better or for worse, that's where all the attention goes.
True. And you used the word defense and defensive to describe Punk's attitude when he came in. And I would describe it as fiery from having watched the press conference. It seemed like not only was he feeling defensive, he had I don't know what to call it, a vendetta to answer these questions that he felt like people were directing at him. And what do you think instigated that? Was it just he was emotional after wrestling in Chicago and a great main event with Jon Moxley and winning the world title and bleeding a ton, as some people have said? Maybe his blood sugar was just too low. I mean, he was munching on muffins the whole time. But what do you think made him so defensive?
I mean, I can't say for sure. I'm not in CM Punk's shoes. I would have to imagine his adrenaline was pretty high coming off of that main event for sure. I believe that he probably has heard these media reports in the past couple of weeks that talked about the Colt Cabana situation and some of the drama amongst the ranks and tension amongst the ranks. And I imagine that it probably just reached a boiling point for him personally. How much of that was justified? Who's to say? That's not for me to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important when you're covering something that all sides are represented and everyone has a say in order to maintain as, I don't necessarily know if unbiased is the word, but as objective of a story or as objective of a presentation as you can provide. So that was his perspective. It clearly was something that upset him personally, and that was the way in which he chose to address it. Whether that was the right way or the wrong way is not for me to say, but I would imagine based off the general perception, many feel it wasn't.
I feel like maybe some context, again, is appropriate for people who are listening to the replay as they read this. So let's rewind a little bit back to Hangman Page being the world champion, CM Punk being the challenger, and there were some very contentious things being said by both sides, including Hangman Page at the time saying that CM Punk claims to be for the locker room and for the boys, but that's not what he sees Punk doing.
Again, I'm not in the locker room, so I don't really know entirely what the circumstances are there, but that seems to have been the sticking point for CM Punk. And if that was something that upset him, you would hope that in a functioning society, you go and you approach it in person, behind the scenes, in front of nobody, between the two of you, and you iron it out. And evidently, that didn't seem to be the case. I also do think it's worth noting that Punk was gone for a few months, so mediation may have been a little more difficult in that regard, too. So, again, I don't want to be accusatory here because it's easy to put on our Monday morning quarterback hat, but at the same time, there are circumstances here that people are not necessarily aware of.
Right. There are things that obviously we don't know. We're not in the locker room, and frankly, it's none of our business. But then again, if they go out on live television or live media conferences and start talking about this, they're kind of putting it in the public maybe when it shouldn't even be. Like when Punk goes out with a live mic to start dropping pipe bombs, as he likes to call it, and he says, that's not cowboy shit, that's coward shit. You're taking things that belonged in the locker room or behind the scenes between individuals and making it public on television.
Yeah, I mean, that is what happened. So I understand the public interest in it. But again, the way that I perceive it, it's hard for me to say, oh, this is what should have happened or this is how it should have been done, because the reality is none of us are there. So
right.
You hear the reports, you read the reports, you hear what's said, but circumstances are different when people are in the middle of the fire itself.
Okay, middle of the fire. That's a perfect segue, because now let's talk about what you were in the room for and what you were a part of, because that fire got very hot. Punk called out reporters by name. Nick Houseman, Brian Alvarez. He had targets and he was shooting.
And again, he felt that he had personal gripes with these individuals. It's so far from the first time I've ever seen something like this happen. I mean, it has happened to me many times in press conferences, not pro wrestling press conferences, but traditional sports press conferences, by coaches, by players. When people feel like there's something personal to address, they will address it personally. And for a lot of these people, there isn't a direct avenue to these individuals, or they feel there isn't. So they take advantage of the opportunities that they have in that respective moment to address them. Is that fair? Maybe not. But what are you going to do? And that's your job as a journalist or a reporter, or whatever you consider yourself, to stand by your convictions and maintain your stance.
And I felt like Brian did that when he got the opportunity to respond. He said, I didn't take anything out of context. I gave both sides of the story. There were some people who agreed with what you said about Page and some people who didn't, and I covered both sides.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Brian said. So I certainly think he held his ground in that sense.
I feel like all the reporters who he came after did. Although the weirdest one to me was when he was asking people if they were friends with Scott Colton. And for those who don't know, that's Colt Cabana. Like from the beginning of the press conference, my judgment of it was that he had an axe to grind about Colt Cabana because he was tired of hearing about it, or he was angry at it, or both. So bringing up Scott Colton like that and then saying things like, when we did discovery on the lawsuit, we found that he shared a bank account with his mother. It's like, why are we hearing about this? Why is he going after Scott Colton's character? It just didn't make sense.
I think he had a personal thing that he wanted to get off his chest. I think it was premeditated to a degree in which he knew that he was going to walk into that press conference and talk about that. At least that's the impression I got. I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's why we heard him discussing those things.
Premeditated is definitely the word I would use. Man, it was surreal to be listening to it, to be watching it, and thinking to myself, this is how. I mean, I didn't know there was going to be a fight later. Nobody knew that, but I'm thinking to myself, this is how fights get started when you go to a press conference or you get in front of a live camera and you start talking shit about people and they hear about it later. That's how fights get started.
Yeah, again, for me, and listen, I'm not trying to sound holier than thou here by any stretch of the imaginations. For me, him going on these tangents in the press conference, while it was certainly aggressive and weird, it's not like this is the first time I've seen something like this happen in a press conference. I know for a lot of people who may only know the wrestling bubble that that's what it feels like, and that's totally understandable. For me, that wasn't this jaw-dropping, shocking thing. It was unprofessional to a degree, I think many would argue, but I don't think it was this jaw-dropping, oh my goodness, I can't believe that an athlete would go after somebody else. For me, the more shocking stuff and what was so surreal was that there were real-time physical altercations as the rest of the press conference was going on. And, you had the owner of the company right there on stage as this was all happening. And that was truly surreal.
I do want to get to that. So I'll save some of my other questions for a little bit later because I first want to know, we've heard these reports and only you can attest to what you saw. So the report that security went running out of the press conference, is that accurate, inaccurate?
Yes, that's completely accurate. There's a security guard that burst through a door while I believe Keith Lee and Swerve were on the podium.
Okay. Did it look frantic, like, oh my God, I got to go right now, I got to break something up? Or was it, I mean, it
Yes.
could have been a medical
Yes.
emergency. You don't know.
I mean, it could have been anything, but it was certainly frantic. It was certainly something is happening.
Yeah. And were any of the reporters in the room as this occurred, like, communicating that they had heard something was going on, or did nobody know what was going on?
I can't speak for anybody else. I know that maybe about 10 minutes after that happened, I got my first message that that punches had been thrown.
And at that point, was it clear who instigated throwing punches, or was it all still up in the air?
No, I just had heard that punches were being thrown.
Right. Now, we've heard so many variations of this story in the last 2 days, and I think this is another one of those cases where, unless you were a fly on the wall in the locker room, nobody's going to really know. But one account has it that the Young Bucks kicked down the door of CM Punk's locker room, and he and Ace Steel and Ace Steel's wife were in the locker room together, and that Punk and Ace Steel felt like they were defending themselves. And another is that the Young Bucks just walked in and started yelling at him, and Punk took exception to it and threw a punch. Now, in either of these situations, cooler heads should have prevailed.
I mean, I think that's what happens anytime you hear an altercation like this happens. You're always going to get two sides to every story. And, if the report that there's going to be an independent investigator brought onto this is accurate, then that sounds like probably the proper avenue to go about trying to figure out what exactly went down.
Now, I've heard the word instigating being used a lot, and I think even before anybody got into anybody's locker room, the comments that Punk was making were instigating in and of themselves. When he refers to empty-headed Adam Page and EVPs who couldn't run a target, who think they're still in Reseda, I mean, even for a guy who's known for dropping pipe bombs, this was clearly inflammatory rhetoric.
Yeah, it certainly was an aggressive line of attacking a situation.
Dare I say, Phil Brooks has already blocked me on Twitter, so if he's going to get mad at me for saying this, it doesn't matter, but I just wonder what in the world he could have meant by people who haven't been anywhere and done anything, because last time I checked, both Adam Page and the Young Bucks have worked in New Japan Pro Wrestling and been all around the world as professional wrestlers, so they've clearly never been anywhere nor never done anything. You saw the security guard go running. Swerve and Keith Lee were trying to answer questions from the media, and at that point, what was the situation in the room? Did any of the other reporters leave? Did everybody stay? What was going down at that moment?
Everybody stayed. It was clear something had happened. After, I think it was after Tony Storm left, there was a brief pause because from what I'd been led to believe, we were supposed to get the Young Bucks, but they pivoted to Chris Jericho for obvious reasons now. And there was a little bit of a pause, and we were waiting for Jericho, and there were texts being sent. So there was a little bit of an awkward holdup there, and I think that's where people started to really start to realize that something had gone down.
And there were some confusing reports the immediate aftermath of the press conference. Some people were saying that someone whispered in Tony Khan's ear to let him know what was going on because he didn't have his phone. And then people showed pictures of him using his phone during the press conference. So did somebody actually come and whisper to him or not?
I mean, I think watching it back, Chris Jericho said something to him. It looks apparent that Chris Jericho said something along the lines of some shit went down, but I don't directly recall a PR official or anybody else of that nature informing him, but I don't want to speculate on that front. I was a little surprised that a PR official nor Tony shut things down as this stuff was happening, because just historically speaking, in press conferences I've been in where stuff has happened, that's exactly what's happened. The press, a PR official or whoever would say, all right, guys, we're wrapping up. And I kind of expected that to happen, but it didn't.
Right. Like when you get a situation where John Jones and Daniel Cormier start throwing shit at each other and shoving each other, that might be the time you say, like, guys, this is over. We're all getting out of here.
Yeah, I sort of expected something like that to happen, but it didn't.
It does seem to me like we have a precedent already when Eddie Kingston got in a backstage fight with Sammy Guevara and got suspended. It feels like that was the precedent. Like when these things happen, you suspend people.
Yeah, and I mean, based on the reports, it sounds like there are some suspensions that are coming about. So that seems to be the course of action at the very least. We don't, as the time of this recording, we don't know the full extent of the punishments, but it certainly seems like there are some degrees of suspensions going on, which I think would be expected in a situation like this.
Agreed. Now, back to the actual pay-per-view itself. Let's talk about the matches since it just hasn't been the focus to this point, and I want to know what you thought of the pay-per-view as a whole and what your favorite matches were from the event.
I thought the show was good. I thought last year's All Out was one of the best wrestling shows I've ever been to, so in comparison, it didn't quite match that, but I still thought it was a very good show. It was long. I enjoyed both trios matches. I thought both trios matches were really good. I thought the main event was great. I thought Jon Moxley and CM Punk had an awesome main event. They told a great story. It was physical. It was brutal. I really enjoyed it. And that's a shame, especially with the big angle that happened, that this is what everybody's talking about, because it was really good. And, yeah, I mean, there were definitely some matches across the board that I thought were strong. I didn't necessarily think anything was bad, per se. I thought the tag team championship match was excellent. Told a great story, and they really showed how to climax a tag team match at the right time. And I thought the inside cradle near fall from Anthony Bowens was one of the best near falls I've ever seen in person. So, yeah, I thought it was a good show. Best AEW pay-per-view ever? No, but good show.
Yeah. Now, there were some injury reports coming out of that, and one of them may have been in the melee afterwards, and one of them may have been during the match itself. So let me start with that. Did you see a point where CM Punk might have injured his arm or been holding his elbow, like he did something to it during the match?
I personally didn't notice anything, but I also haven't watched the match back yet.
Fair enough. Ruby Soho definitely has a broken nose, though. There's no doubt about that one.
Yeah, she definitely seems like she got a little bloodied early on. That was a pretty physical way to start the show. It was a unique way to start the show. I'm glad that with the amount of times that match has been done, I'm glad they found a different way to present it.
Are you a fan of mixed gender or intergender matches in general?
I could go either way. I see the merits of both sides of the equation in terms of the argument. especially as we're more cognizant of domestic violence, that is maybe an optic that's not super great. But I also understand that it's scripted entertainment and that these are people who are consciously aware of what they're doing with one another. It's not them just shooting on each other. So I understand the value on both sides of it.
Agreed. And I mean, like you said, when it comes to being scripted, we know that as physical as a match gets, like Eddie Kingston and Tomohiro Ishii, the rematch that they had, it's all in the context of the story being told. It's like, that may hurt, but they both agreed to hurt each other beforehand.
Yeah, they certainly did, and they beat the absolute crap out of each other. Those chops were vicious.
Do you see a match like that and think it's a shame this is on the free show instead of the pay per view itself?
I mean, look, if it's on a free show, it means there's an opportunity for even more people to see it. So I certainly don't look at it as a negative in that regard. But it was an entertaining way to get the show going for sure.
I've had this argument with my co-host Peter so many times about UFC shows when he says, "Why are they putting Uriah Faber on free television before the pay-per-view?" And my response back has always been, because they want people to tune in and then maybe
Yeah,
buy the pay-per-view because they just saw something great.
yeah. I mean, I think that's the mentality with it. I did think it was not necessary that we had, was it 4 or 5 matches on the pre-show? It was a little bit of a long pre-show. But I also, as you said, I know how UFC preliminaries work and MMA preliminaries work, where sometimes you do get a ton of matches before the actual main card starts.
As for the length of the show, I mean, we've already talked about how many matches were on the pre-show. Was it too long? Was it too much? Does AEW need to rein it in a little bit?
Their shows are really long. There's no doubt about it. It makes for a pretty exhausting experience live and on TV. I think Tony Khan feels that since they have 4 pay-per-views, they got to cram as much as they can. But I think some of those matches are best served on a main event of a Dynamite and gives people more TV exposure.
I also think that there's room to expand. Maybe they could go from 4 to 6 or even 8 pay-per-views. It seems like if you can get 150 to 200,000 people buying a show, there's enough people who will buy even 8 shows. If it's only 100,000, you still make more than four with 150.
Yeah, and maybe they can. I know for AEW, one of the big things that they really get to do are those live specials on the Turner networks and branding episodes of Dynamite. I think those are important to them. So I think at the risk of getting rid of those, they may be more enticed to still stick with the pay-per-view format, especially as they enter renegotiations for their next television contract.
And what's your sense of those renegotiations ever since Warner Brothers and Discovery had this big merger? Do you feel like that's made AEW vulnerable, or are they strong enough in the ratings that they're going to be fine?
I mean, all indications are that Tony Khan and Warner Media have a good relationship right now, so I don't believe there's any dissension amongst the ranks. Yeah, AEW at $45 million a year, whatever the TV deal is now, is still a bargain compared to what Warner Bros. Discovery is spending on their other scripted content and unscripted content. So it seems like an easy investment for whoever it is their buyer to make, especially since it's guaranteed content every single week.
Right. And I mean, when you compare it to the hundreds of millions to even billions that get spent on professional sports leagues and World Wrestling Entertainment, 45 million is almost a drop in the bucket by comparison.
Yeah, it certainly is.
It doesn't seem like something they would need to cut from the budget to save themselves money, but we have seen a lot of streaming shows get dropped. We have seen a lot of scripted television shows get cut. So I think that made people nervous. Just like you said, the word optics comes to mind here. They're looking at the optics like, wow, this new Warner Brothers conglomerate is cutting everything in sight. They dropped a feature motion picture just cold that was already in the can.
Yeah, that was definitely a choice move with Batgirl. I'm curious to see how they handle the Flash.
Ezra Miller is quite a headache. He's a different one than CM Punk. Like, CM Punk causes people to get in their feelings, but Ezra, he just gets into trouble, period.
Yeah, that has not been a great situation, so I guess we'll see how they navigate that.
Yeah, well, all I can say to them is good luck sorting that one out. But back to All Out. When the press conference did end and everybody started to file out and go home for the evening, what was the mood? How were people reacting? Were people still getting texts about the fight? What was going on at that point?
Yeah, it was something that was a developing situation, I think, afterwards, and it was most definitely contentious throughout. Ultimately, there weren't that many people. It was just myself and other media members, so I don't know how fans felt about it, but it was more, okay, now how do we put the pieces together and try to figure out what actually went down here?
Mm-hmm. Did you feel like it was going to be a long night and a long couple of days ahead? Like, this is going to be a story that never ends?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tweeted it even. I said, I think tonight is going to be one of the biggest nights in wrestling history. So I feel like I recognized it in the aftermath, and I do believe that there's a very real chance that when all is said and done, it will have been.
I think this might be the $64,000 question, and if I'm wrong, you let me know. But in the immediate aftermath, I'm not just talking to fellow wrestling writers and podcasters, I'm talking to fans as well. And a lot of them were saying things to me like, this is a work. They planned this all. Tony Khan is a genius. He came up with this whole idea. I think this idea has percolated in people's heads ever since Montreal that somehow these things have to be planned, that there can't be cameras there can't be reporters there, that these things don't just happen. And sometimes, yes, they do just happen.
Yeah, I mean, I unequivocally cannot say enough that this was not planned or anything about it. This is not a work. This is all real life that happened. I can't say that clear enough, and if people don't want to believe it, then they don't have to, but it's reality. Now, does that mean that it can't turn into a, quote, work? Sure, it can if cooler heads prevail and everyone comes on, they come to their realization that they can make a lot of money on this. Sure, it can become a work. But as things stand, as we record this, all of this is very real life.
One of the conspiracy theories that I saw being touted was that people in the press were told to come. And my perception, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that people were told to come because it was a long night and it was going to be hard to get reporters to stay. And they were being told, it's going to be run smoothly. Everybody's going to be on a stopwatch. Please come because it'll be organized and you won't be here all night. Now, am I right or wrong?
I mean, when that report was put out there, that was the first that I was hearing, that people were told to come. I had never heard that. So maybe there were one or two reporters that were told to come by PR people or something, trying to encourage them to come cover the event. But I have no idea what that report was referring to. I've never been told to come or not to come to a press conference before in my career. So again, I think that's just something that maybe one or two people were told by a PR official or someone, hey, like, we got some good gets for this, but there's certainly no conspiracy theory there.
Right. There wasn't somebody walking around tapping everybody on the shoulder and going, hey, some shit's going to happen. You're going to want to be there.
No. I'm glad I actually wasn't going to go because I was so tired. I was in Chicago for other events and I was so tired, but I was like, you know what, I'm here. I may as well just go. And I'm certainly glad I did.
Awesome. So, yeah, you were quite busy, probably very little sleep and a lot of recording to do. So that was a hell of a weekend, and I can understand why you might have wanted to duck out of the press conference at that point.
Yeah, no doubt. And I had an early morning flight too. So I know historically how long these AEW press availabilities go. Sometimes they've gone 2.5 hours. Thankfully, I think this one was only about an hour. So it ended up being okay.
John, I do want to let you get in some plugs for adfreeshows.com. As you said, Conrad's excellent network of podcasts and media programming and different tiers for different people, whatever level you want to choose. So please do some plugs at this time.
Yeah, I mean, you can check out The Extreme Life of Matt Hardy. It drops every single Friday at 6 a.m. Eastern, wherever you get your podcast, early access on adfreeshows.com. I host a plethora of shows on ad-free shows as well. DDP Snake Pit, The Wives of Wrestling. We have a whole Strictly Business with Eric Bischoff and many more great offerings over there and on the Podcast Heat Network. So you can go check out my stuff there, and I'm on Twitter at Jon Alba, JONALBA.
All right, and one last question before I let you go, since you mentioned Eric Bischoff. He is a rather contentious and polarizing figure himself, as CM Punk is sometimes prone to be. What do you think when Eric Bischoff offers opinions about AEW and what they should or shouldn't do? I know you said you don't want to editorialize, but he sure seems to.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Eric is certainly more than entitled to his opinions. He has way more experience in the industry than I have. There's no doubting that. So he's more than entitled to say whatever he wants to say. You know, I think one of the beauties of my work with Eric is that he and I do have differing opinions and different viewpoints on the industry. So as a result of that, I think it creates good content.
Yeah, I agree with that because he gets really fired up about how they should or shouldn't handle things, and I appreciate you being a counterpoint to that sometimes because when I feel like he goes too far, you give the other side of the story.
That's certainly what I try to do, find a good dynamic with him. And yeah, we certainly don't see eye to eye on everything, and that's okay. You know, we respect each other and just try to provide different perspectives.
Well, I think adfreeshows.com provides a lot of different perspectives with a lot of great shows, and I don't think it would be possible without you there, Jon, so thank you for all the tremendous work that you do.
Thank you, Steve.
I appreciate your time today, and hopefully we'll be able to chat again sometime in the near future.
No doubt, man. Thank you so much.
You bet. Take care. Have a great day.